Hello guys, welcome to our last lecture on the female reproductive system. Today we're going to do a basic review on the anatomy, so we're going to talk about the uterus, the ovaries, the uterine tubes, various glands, and external genitalia. We're going to look at oogenesis, which is egg formation. And we're going to look at the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle. So we're going to look at the stages of follicle development. We're going to look at the hormones involved, and we're going to look at what's happening in the uterus during the monthly cycle. So first, let's start with the anatomy. We're going to look at what the female external and internal genital structures are, what their functions are. We're going to focus in on the ovary. We're going to talk about what a follicle is, what are the roles and names of the cells surrounding the follicle, and what the roles and the names of the cells surrounding the follicle. We're going to look at the different stages of follicular development, what's happening during each stage, and what hormones are involved. We're going to look at how the uterine tubes capture the ovulated oocyte, the function of the uterus, and the layers of the uterine wall. So let's start with the female reproductive anatomy. If we look at our external reproductive structures, we have here the labium major, the labium minor, the clitoris, which is the erectile tissue in the female reproductive system, and the greater vestibular gland, which is the equivalent of our bulbourethral gland. In that it secretes mucus. We have our ovaries, which is where our eggs are made. And where our sex hormones are made. Our uterine tubes, the uterus itself, then our cervix, this region in here, and the vagina. Note that the opening for the vagina and the opening for the urethra are two separate openings. This is one of the differences in between the male and female reproductive system. Remember, in the male reproductive system, it was a single tube. Here it's two separate tubes. Here we can see a better view of the external genitalia. So here is the mons pubis, which is a fatty dome. Our external labia majora, the internal labia minora, the clitoris, the external urethral orifice, and the opening for the vagina. It's also important here to see how close the opening of the anus is to the opening of the urethra and the vagina, because this is one of the reasons that fecal bacteria have a much easier time to get into either the female reproductive tract or the female urethral tract. If you remove that top layer of tissue, you can see our two greater vestibular glands, which, remember, produce mucus. And you can see the clitoris, which has the corpora cavernosa, similar to the erectile tissue in the penis. Here we can see this region of the cervix and the vagina. The vagina is a pathway or menses and childbirth. The cervix actually does play a role in regulating what material can enter the uterus. Because for most of the month, there's a cervical plug. Which is highly thick mucus that the sperm find difficult to travel through. The ovaries are where the eggs are found. And where they're ovulated from. It's also where our sex hormones are produced. So in the female, the two primary sex hormones are estrogen and progesterone. The ovaries are held in place by a few ligaments. You've got the ovarian ligament, which connects the ovary to the side of the uterus, and you've got the broad ligament, which are the sheets of connective tissue that connect not just the ovary to the uterus, but the uterine tubes to the ovaries and the uterine tubes to the uterus itself. If we look at an ovary in cross-section, we're going to see several different follicles in different stages of development. So humans are born with all of the primordial follicles that they're ever going to have. But once a month, FSH is produced by the anterior pituitary, and that stimulates some of our follicles to grow. So those follicles become primary follicles. Primary follicles start to develop granulosa cells. And as they develop an antrum, they become secondary follicles. Then one follicle gets largest the fastest. And one of our secondary follicles starts to produce the hormone inhibin. And inhibin inhibits FSH. By acting on GnRH. So the follicle that gets the largest the fastest and starts to secrete inhibin becomes what's known as a vesicular follicle. On day 14, this vesicular follicle ruptures. So this is day 14 of the ovarian cycle. And you end up with ovulation. What's left of the follicle becomes what's known as the corpus luteum, which just means yellow body, and the corpus luteum continues to produce estrogen, but it adds in another hormone which isn't made prior to day 14 of the ovarian cycle, which is progesterone. So our corpus luteum will continue to produce these hormones, and if fertilization doesn't occur, our corpus luteum starts to die, it forms a scar called the corpus albicans, which means white body, and the whole cycle starts all over again. You can see surrounding the ovaries, you have, at one end, you have the uterine tube, which is made up of fimbria, which help guide the egg into the uterine tube. They actually have ciliated cells on them that beat and help pull the egg into the uterine tube. It's important to note that there's not a physical connection, like it's not a continuous tube system like you see in the male. The uterine tube is just draped over the ovary. It's actually in the uterine tube where fertilization occurs. Not in the uterus. Now, because the uterine tubes aren't continuous with the ovaries, it is possible for the ovum to become fertilized and implant into either the peritoneal cavity or the distal portion of the fallopian tube. Neither the peritoneal cavity or the distal portion of the fallopian tube are set up to carry a fetus to term. So usually the pregnancy is going to abort naturally with heavy bleeding, not heavy breathing. Please note that despite what it says on Facebook and TikTok and various websites, it actually isn't possible to remove an ectopic pregnancy and implant it into the uterus. I don't know who started that rumor, but it's not possible. The uterus itself functions to carry a developing embryo. To term. And it's the uterine lining that gets built up in response to estrogen. And it gets shed if fertilization doesn't happen. So if you look at the uterine tube in more detail, you've got an outer parametrium, a middle myometrium, which is smooth muscle, and an inner endometrial layer. And this is the layer that gets built up and gets lost if fertilization doesn't occur. So if we look at that endometrium diagrammatically, it actually has glands and blood vessels that every month build themselves up and elaborate themselves. And then if fertilization doesn't occur, those blood vessels and glands are lost. And the endometrium is actually divided into two layers. The stratum functionalis is the layer that can be lost. And the stratum basalis is the layer that remains. To be built up again. After menses. So if you look in this picture, below this line, where your smooth muscle is, that's your myometrium. This layer here, which contains the spiral arteries and the base of our uterine glands, that's our stratum basalis. And then above the stratum basalis, where the tubes are for the uterine gland, that's the stratum functionalis. The next topic that we're going to talk about is oogenesis, which is formation of the eggs. Now, there are several differences that occur in between oogenesis and spermatogenesis, so I'll try and point that out as we go. So we're going to look at what's happening during oogenesis. We're going to look at the stages of the ovarian cycle, which we've already introduced a little bit. what's happening during each phase and how hormones are driving this cycle. We're going to look at a little bit how the ovarian cycle is established. Then we're going to look at the phases of the menstrual cycle, how long they last, what happens during each phase, and how the hormones are regulating the cycle. What causes menses, and a little bit about the extrauterine effects of estrogen and progesterone. So one of the major differences in between oogenesis and spermatogenesis is that all the eggs you were ever going to have actually been made before you were even born. So you've actually gone from about 7 million cells at around 5 months to down around approximately 2 million by the time you're born. Those numbers are going to continue to go down until menopause, which is when occurs in humans and great apes. It's when females basically have used up all of their eggs. This is different from the male reproductive system in that the male reproductive system doesn't start producing sperm until puberty. And this has an immunological side effect, I guess, in that the male reproductive system actually has to separate the sperm from the immune system because the sperm would be considered non-self cells, while the female reproductive system doesn't. So before birth, all of our oogonia have completed their mitotic division. So oogonium, after they undergo mitosis, will start meiosis. And that's going to basically be arrested in prophase 1. Isn't going to proceed through it at all. So this is what stage our primordial follicles are in. During childhood, the primary oocytes are going to remain in prophase 1, and they aren't going to develop any further until puberty. At puberty, you release GnRH from the hypothalamus, which stimulates the release of LH, luteinizing hormone, and FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. So follicle stimulating hormone will start a handful of those primordial follicles and cause them to develop into primary follicles. FSH will continue to stimulate the conversion of primary follicles into secondary follicles. And in your secondary follicles, you can now start to see 2 different cell types, our granulosa cells and our thecal cells. So thecal cells are similar to interstitial cells or Leydig cells in men in that they produce testosterone. Granulosa cells produce aromatase, which converts testosterone to estrogen. So luteinizing hormone has the same effect on men and women in that in both it stimulates the production of testosterone, but in females, the aromatase from the granulosa cells immediately converts most of the testosterone into estrogen. So we're going to start with our primordial follicles. Our primordial follicles get stimulated by FSH to become primary follicles. Our primary follicles are going to have cells known as granulosa cells and our thecal cells. Also under the control of FSH, our primary follicles, some of them will become secondary follicles. Our secondary follicles, when they get large enough, the one that gets biggest the fastest produces inhibin. And that turns all of our other follicles off so that our largest follicle continues to grow in the absence of FSH, and it becomes our vesicular follicle. Now, in reality, this whole process doesn't occur over a month. Maturation of a primordial follicle to a vesicular follicle actually takes about a year, about 350 days. It's just that you have this process going on sequentially all the time, so that you always have some secondary follicles that at the start of the month under FSH will start to grow until one becomes dominant and produces inhibin. You're always restarting the conversion of a primordial follicle to a primary follicle. It's just that the whole process takes 350 days, but you have several groups of cells that get started each month in this process. So here you can see your primordial follicles, your primary follicles, secondary, and you can start to see, if you zoom in on this, the follicular fluid starting to develop. Here's your late secondary follicles with the forming antrum. Here's your vesicular follicles here with the zona pellucida around the egg itself and a whole group of cells around that. On day 14, of our ovarian cycle, our follicle ruptures. That releases the egg into the abdominal pelvic cavity. What's left of the follicle forms our corpus luteum, which continues to produce estrogen and progesterone. So let's look at this first feedback loop in a little bit more detail. So our hypothalamus releases GnRH, which stimulates the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH. FSH stimulates follicular growth. LH causes the growth of thecal cells. Thecal cells produce androgens, which get converted by granulosa cells into estrogen. Your increase in estrogen is going, and rising inhibin levels is going to turn off GnRH, FSH, and LH. And so one of our follicles, the one that no longer depends on FSH, will become a mature vesicular follicle. Now, something weird happens as our vesicular follicle gets ready to ovulate. Normally, estrogen inhibits LH and FSH. But when estrogen levels get high enough, they actually flip that feedback loop. So it's no longer a negative feedback loop, it becomes a positive feedback loop. And so it's that positive feedback loop that on day 14 causes a surge in luteinizing hormone, which is what triggers ovulation. After ovulation, our remaining follicular cells become our corpus luteum, and they produce progesterone, estrogen, and inhibin. So if we divide the ovarian cycle into two phases, day 1 through day 14 is our follicular phase. Because that's the period of follicle growth. At day 14, we get ovulation. And then from day 14 until the end of the ovarian cycle, which can be in between 28 and 35 days, you have the luteal phase, which is where the corpus luteum is active. So here you can see the fluctuations in follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone over the course of our ovarian cycle. You can see as the corpus luteum starts to die, FSH and LH start to go up. They cause the production of estrogen, which inhibits FSH and LH. Then you get that positive feedback loop flipping, and estrogen stimulates our LH and FSH surge, which triggers ovulation. And then the corpus luteum produces estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin, which keep LH and FSH levels low. So if we add our follicular phase and luteal phase, we can see that our follicular phase is the phase where we're going from primordial follicles to ovulation. And then our luteal phase is where the corpus luteum is taking over, and the corpus luteum will produce estrogen, but it will also produce progesterone. And progesterone maintains the endometrial lining. So that's why progesterone is often known as the hormone of pregnancy, because you need high levels of progesterone to keep the endometrial lining intact. So the first direct observation of human ovulation actually occurred in 2008, and every single textbook you're ever going to read shows the ovaries rupturing like some type of volcano or geyser at Yellowstone. But that's not actually what happens. There's no rupturing. Instead, you can see the egg here actually being ovulated out from our follicle. And you can see the tip of a pair of forceps here, just for scale. So this graph again shows our 2 phases of our ovarian cycle, our follicular phase and our luteal phase. And you can see that during the follicular phase, estrogen levels are slowly rising, but progesterone staying basically level. It's not until after ovulation where progesterone starts to be formed by the corpus luteum and progesterone levels go up. So let's put this all together. So from day 1 to day 14, we've got our follicular phase. And then from day 14 on, we have our luteal phase. So these are phases of the ovarian cycle. Down here, we have the 3 phases of the menstrual cycle or uterine cycle. So starting on day 1 is the first day of the menstrual cycle, so that's when menstruation starts. We can see that estrogen levels are low, progesterone levels are basically in the toilet, and LH and FSH levels are increasing. LH stimulates the production of estrogen. Remember, estrogen is coming from the thecal cells, which produce testosterone, and being converted to estrogen by aromatase produced by the granulosa cells. When estrogen reaches a certain level, it flips our negative feedback loop to a positive feedback loop, causing the surge in LH, which triggers ovulation. Then you get formation of the corpus luteum, so you can see progesterone levels are going up. Estrogen levels go up, and they stay up as long as the corpus luteum is surviving. But if fertilization doesn't occur, then estrogen and progesterone levels drop. The corpus luteum becomes our corpus albicans, and the whole process starts over. So if we look at the menstrual cycle, the first 14 days are divided into 2 phases. The menstrual phase, which is when menstruation is occurring, and the proliferative phase. During the proliferative phase, estrogen is stimulating endometrial growth. Then after ovulation, the menstrual cycle starts the secretory phase, where progesterone is maintaining the endometrial lining. So you can see in this figure what's happening during that menstrual phase. So from day 1 through day 5, you're losing the endometrial lining. Then during the proliferative phase, estrogen is stimulating the growth of the endometrial lining. And then after ovulation, the secretory phase occurs. Progesterone is maintaining the endometrial lining, and it's being further prepped for a fertilized embryo to implant. There are extrauterine effects of estrogen and progesterone. While estrogen levels rise during puberty, this does start to promote oogenesis and follicular growth, but it also exerts anabolic effects in the female reproductive tract. So all the reproductive organs get larger, and estrogen is actually what supports the growth spurt that occurs in women at puberty. So this is why, like in between 5th and 7th grade, girls shoot way up really, really fast, and they tend to get taller than boys. And then the boys play catch up over the next couple of years. Estrogen also causes the growth of breasts, an increase in deposition of subcutaneous fat, particularly around the hips and stomach. The pelvis itself becomes wider and it lightens. You grow axillary and pubic hair, and while estrogen levels are high, it does have metabolic effects as well. So this brings us to our last in-class assignment question. So for each of the following hormones in the female, list where they're produced and their functions. This is due the day of the final exam. And for the final exam, you should be able to tell me what these hormones plus GnRH and inhibin do in females, plus you should be able to tell me what inhibin, FSH, LH, GnRH, inhibin, and testosterone do in males. So this was a quite shortened version of my usual female reproduction lecture, but we did cover the main points. So we talked about the anatomy, we talked about oogenesis, and we talked about the ovarian and menstrual cycles. I wish you guys the best of luck on your final exam, and I will see you guys next week.